Welcome to the On-Target HTML5 website YouTube channel. The website is dedicated to teaching web development technologies in HTML5, HTML, CSS, CSS3, PHP, MySQL, Flash, and the XML scripting language. We'll soon be adding a section on JavaScript, so I hope you visit us at www.ontargethtml5.com. Welcome to the PHP Essential Training Series. I'm Mike King, your host, and in this tutorial we're going to talk about understanding variables in PHP. So understanding variables. In this tutorial we're going to discuss using variables in PHP. Understanding the concepts around the use of variables in the PHP programming environment will make your learning the PHP programming language much more achievable. Variables are containers where values can be stored and retrieved by our application when needed. Variables are a fundamental building block of all programming languages. There are a few simple rules to writing variables in PHP. Declaring variables. Unlike many programming languages, in PHP, variables do not need to be declared before they can be used. You can assign a value to a new variable name anytime that you want to start using it. This is not a best practice, and during our training, we will declare our variables prior to use in PHP. It's a good practice to get into, and as you learn other programming languages, it will keep you with normal practices in those languages. Most programming languages require you to declare your variables prior to use. We're going to do that as we learn PHP variables, and actually as we work through the PHP programming tutorials. That is the best practice, so even though it's not required, we will be doing it. Variables are a fundamental building block of all programming languages. Variables in programming are used to place as placeholders for values that you are unsure of or that are subject to change throughout your application. Let's look at some examples of variables in PHP. So I'm going to go ahead and drop down into our development environment, and let's go ahead and work through a couple of examples. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and drop out of our presentation. Let's get into our development environment. I'm going to confirm that my Apache server is up and running. Let's go ahead and load up Sublime Text 2, which will be my text editor for this demonstration, and Google Chrome will be the web browser that we'll be using. And you'll notice I've got the exercise 1 file loaded inside my browser. So the first thing I want to do, I've got my standard HTML5 web page loaded, just a skeleton page. I'm going to come down a couple of lines. I'm going to open up a PHP block, again, less than sign, question mark PHP, and then I'm going to come down a few lines and close that block of code. And again, I close it with my question mark and my greater than sign. And inside the code, let's go ahead and create a couple of variables. So I'm going to create a variable called number, and we're going to go through these naming sequences in a minute, how we actually name our variables. That's going to be equal to 12, and that with a semicolon. Then I'm going to declare another variable, number 2. That's going to be equal to 13, and that with a semicolon. And we end all of our code lines with the semicolon in PHP. Then I'm going to create another variable called sum, and we're actually going to go through a lot of these different operators in a future tutorial. That's going to be equal to the number 1 variable that we created plus the number 2 variable that we created, and that with a semicolon. And then what I want to do is I'm going to say echo. I'm just going to say echo sum. So what I've done, great time to pause if you want to go ahead and type this in. But what I've done here is I've declared a variable called number 1, and a variable is declared in PHP with the $sign. That tells PHP that whatever follows is the name of a variable. And I gave that a value of 12. Then I declared a second variable called number 2, and I gave that a value of 13. Then I declared a third variable, and that third variable is going to be equal to the first 2 variables added together. And this equal is an assignment operator. The plus is an addition operator. We're going to go through all of these. Probably in the next tutorial, I think I'll actually do operators because they're very important in how we work with PHP. But let's go ahead and save those changes to exercise 1. If I refresh my browser window, you'll notice we have a 25 here, and that's what the echo does. Echo actually outputs that value to HTML. If I were to actually look at the source of this document, I'm going to right-click in Google Chrome and just say View Page Source. You'll notice we don't see anything in the body element other than the value 25. We've got our heading 1, which is the heading of the actual body element itself using variables in PHP, but none of the PHP code is actually displayed as source in our page source. So it's not displayed as text inside that page source. And again, I could add my comments like we talked about in a previous tutorial just by adding a comment after our line of code, or I could actually put block comments in the top. But again, none of this stuff is displayed, but we've declared these two variables, and all I'd have to do is change the variable itself. If I wanted to make this 31 and save that change, refresh our browser window, it's going to update our value. And again, because we're using variables, it becomes very dynamic. So let's look at another example. I'm going to go ahead and comment this whole block of code out. And I do that quite a bit, by the way, when I'm doing examples. You notice we can use the /*. I could come down here to the bottom and use */ and that ends the comment. So now that entire block of code becomes a comment. Let's go ahead and put in a horizontal line inside of our HTML document. Of course, we have to be outside our PHP block to do that, because this is an HTML tag. I'm going to put in a line break, and then I want to come down here and open up a new PHP block, come down and close that block. And inside my PHP tags, I'm going to create another variable called first name. I'm going to use Camel Case in the way I declare this. You'll notice that I've capitalized the second word, and I'm just going to say that equals James. And that with a semicolon. I'm going to come down here and create another variable called last name. And now you notice we're using strings as our variables instead of numbers. And I'm going to say Smith, and that with a semicolon. Then I'm going to come down and create a variable called name. That's going to be equal to my first name. So again, I'm taking the value of those variables, and I'm going to actually concatenate. That's what this little dot means. It's actually going to join these together. I'm going to put a space in between, another concatenation sign, and we'll talk about these concatenation symbols when we get into our expressions. I'm going to say last name, and that with a semicolon, and then I'm going to come down and just say echo, and inside quotation marks, because I'm actually going to use some HTML in here, I'm going to put this inside of an H3 tag. Then I'm going to use the name of the variable, and then I'm going to close out that H3 tag. So what we've done here is we've actually taken the value of this name variable, we're going to echo that to our screen, and we're actually going to echo it as an H3, because we can actually intermix HTML tags and PHP in those blocks. And you're going to see us do a lot of this as we work through these exercises. Let's go ahead and save this as exercise number 2 inside our demonstrations. I'm going to go back, go ahead and refresh my browser and load exercise number 2. And you'll notice now we've actually echoed James Smith onto our screen as an H3 element from the value of that variable. And again, keep in mind that if I were to view this page source, let's go ahead and close out that first one. Let's go ahead and view the page source. It doesn't show us anything except the value of the H3. We're not seeing any of that PHP inside the source of that page. So it's a very important concept of PHP variables and how we use PHP code inside of HTML. We're going to drop back into our presentation for a minute and discuss a little more about variable naming. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and drop down out of our development environment. Let's get back into our presentation. So let's talk about naming variables in PHP. When naming variables, the more descriptive the name, the better. This way, when you come back to your code in a few months, and you will, you'll remember what the variable was used for inside your code. Variables in PHP will always begin with a $. Variables in PHP are case sensitive. For example, price is not the same variable as the capital P price. Keep this in mind when you're doing your naming of your variables. Variable names can only contain letters, numbers, and the underscore character, and each must begin with a letter or an underscore. You cannot begin your variable names with a number. So let's look at some variable name examples. Here we have some examples of valid and invalid variable names. You'll notice on the left-hand side, I've got the $%, and then on the right, I've got the $PER with the % sign, and that's an invalid variable name because the % sign is not a valid character inside of a PHP variable. The next one down is the last name. You'll notice I've got the $ last underscore name. That's a valid variable name. But if you look to the right, you'll see last name with a hyphen, invalid variable name because we can't use a hyphen. That's a special character. You'll notice I've got first name started with an underscore. That's a valid variable name in variables, but we'll talk about why you don't want to use $_ when we get further along in the tutorials. It's a valid name and you can use it, but when we use a $ and an underscore, normally we're signifying a global variable. We'll talk more about that when we get into our demonstrations. To the right, you'll see that I've got the number sign with the number 1 and line. We can't use any numbers inside to start our variable names. We can use a number in a variable name, but it can't be the first character in the variable name. And keep in mind the $ does not count as a character. That just signifies a variable inside PHP. And then again, I got $ my variable, lowercase my, uppercase variable. That's a valid variable name. And to the right, you'll see that I've got the $ with a number symbol, my variable. That's invalid because, again, the number symbol is not a valid character in variable names in PHP. Using underscore characters is a way of using multiple words with separation in your variable names. This way you can have space between the words. A lot of people do that. I don't. My recommended way to name variables is using Camel Case. I don't like those separations for a variety of reasons, but the biggest thing being is a lot of times it'll be mistaken for a space. And again, spaces are not valid characters in variable names, and it's sometimes harder to read when you're actually typing in your code. I will be demonstrating this throughout the tutorial series is using Camel Case. I use it for most all my names inside of programming. Always keep in mind that PHP is case sensitive, so you want to name your variables accordingly. A variable name in PHP must always begin with the $. The first character after the $. Cannot be a number. No spaces or punctuation marks except for the underscore. And so in wrapping up, naming variables in PHP, you're limited to letters, numbers, and the underscore character. Special cases. This, in other words, a $ with this, is used in PHP object-oriented programming and should never be used in your variable naming. So don't use the word this preceded by that $. And again, because it's used in PHP OOP programming, object-oriented programming, which we'll get into towards the end of the series. So it's kind of a reserved word, don't use it. And if you're looking to get a list of reserved words in PHP, you can actually go to the www.php.net/manual/en for English, and then /reserve.php, and it will give you a complete listing of reserved words in PHP. Most of them pertain to the programming language itself. But I would recommend you just go there and look in the event you're unsure of what words are reserved inside the PHP programming languages. Best practices: choose names that have a meaningful description. Use camel case or underscores for multiple words and variable names. And I'm giving you 2 examples on the screen. Remember, in PHP, variable names are case sensitive. That's extremely important because, like I said, if you use a variable name with a capital and refer to it as a variable name with lowercase, it's 2 completely different variables in PHP and it will not be recognized. So let's move back into the development environment and work through another exercise on variables inside PHP. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and drop out of our presentation. Let's go back into our development environment. Again, confirming my PHP server, or my XAMPP server, I should say, Apache is up and running. I want to bring up my web browser and bring up my text editor, Sublime Text 2 for this example. Where we left off with the last example, I'm going to go ahead and do a save as. Let's go ahead and save this as exercise file number 3. And I'm going to go ahead and pull out this code that we had for the last exercise. We're going to do something a little bit different. And again, I just want to emphasize how we use variables. I'm actually going to copy this from the exercise file so you don't have to watch me type it. And we'll talk about it as I put it in. I'm going to go ahead right below that H1 heading and just go ahead and paste in this PHP code. Here I'm declaring a group of variables. I've got a name variable, again, starting with the $ equals John. And again, this is a string variable. We'll talk about data types in a future tutorial. Then I've got age, which is a number variable. You'll notice that the numbers are not enclosed in quotation marks. Then I've got a full name variable, age at retirement variable, which is another number. And then I've got a calculation. I'm going years to go, and that's going to equal age at retirement minus age. So we've got 5 different variables that we've declared up here, and we're going to use those inside of our HTML. I'm going to come out of here and drop out of the PHP block and just put in HR. That's a horizontal rule across our screen. Let me go back here, by the way, in this local host, and let's go ahead and load up this exercise 3 file. All right, so I'm going to go ahead from the exercise file, copy another group of code in here. I'm going to add an H3 tag. So I'm going to come right down below that horizontal rule. Go ahead and type this in place, or paste this in place, I should say. I've got just a couple of paragraphs and an H3. Let's go ahead and turn on word wrap so you can actually see what we've got up here. Now would be a great time to pause if you want to go ahead and type this in, and then we'll talk through what we've done here. All right, so I've designated an H3. I'm going to go ahead and reload this in our browser window. Save all these changes, reload that. I've got an H3 here that has information, and then what I've done is from those 5 variables that we've declared at the top of our code, I've actually pulled those out and put those inside my HTML. And you'll notice I've got an opening PHP tag, then I'm echoing the value of a variable, then I'm closing the PHP tag. And I've only done this demonstration so that you can see that we can actually intermix variables inside of our HTML documents, and that's what I'm doing here. I'm actually using the echo statement and the print statement, 2 different statements that do similar things inside of PHP, but they're actually displaying this on our HTML page. You'll notice that the first name is saying thank you, and then I'm taking the first names and it says thank you, John. We appreciate your interest in our products. I understand that your age is 29 and you have 36 years until you retire. So we're actually going in and pulling the age variable out. I'm going and pulling the years to go variable out. And again, they're enclosed in PHP tags, and I'm echoing the value to the screen, the value of the variable. And in the very last one, I actually used a print statement, which basically does the same thing. It echoes the value of the variable to the screen. If I look at the view source on this, again, I'm going to right click, view page source. You'll see that we don't see any of the PHP itself. We just see the value of those variables that we're echoing to the screen. And that's why it's being displayed as it is in our page. So variables are a very important part of programming. It's very important you understand how we use them, how we name them. You're going to use thousands of them throughout this exercise series, throughout this tutorial series. We're going to be using variables constantly in all of our demonstrations. Just wanted to give you an idea of how we name them, how we assign values to them. Remember that equal sign is an assignment operator, because you're going to see double equals and triple equals as we move through these, and you're going to, don't let them confuse you. The single equal sign is an assignment. We're assigning this value to this variable. And again, we're going to go over this many, many times as we work through the tutorials, but now you should have a good grasp of how we declare a variable in PHP and how we assign it a value. I hope you enjoyed the tutorial. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel. And again, check out our website, www.ontargethtml5.com, for a complete listing of all the tutorials that are available in the development environment. I look forward to your feedback, and thank you for visiting.